When somebody gets diagnosed with cancer, quite often they are just so overwhelmed, so freaked out by this diagnosis, and they want to act immediately. This whole process of getting rid of it is taking too long, and they come on the diet, and they come on this thing about fasting, and they think that they can just do this like 12-day fast and the cancer is going to go away. So maybe 12-day fast might help as far as prevention and wiping out cells before they start to actually build up to the point where they are a cancer. But once you have the cancer, you can impact that, like I said, angiogenesis. You can do the housekeeping with fasting that's going to clear out a lot of dead cells. But there's no reason for me to think that there aren't going to be a few of these little microscopic ones floating around. And so you got to figure out some other strategy for dealing with them long term. And and people go in different directions. They can combine ketogenic diet with conventional care. Sometimes that's real tricky. Or they can combine it with alternative. I guess it just rips my heart up when I see somebody with a really curable cancer, like with a surgery, who could do a fast for, even if it was a week fast or a 5-day fast before they went in for the surgery. Actually, just a few days ago, a paper got accepted, GBM, glioblastoma multiforme, a really aggressive form of brain cancer, case study, clinic in Egypt. And I was working with the authors on this. That guy did a 72-hour fast, and he did 900 calories a day ketogenic prior to his resection, and he had a good resection. And also the tumor that they resected had different histology than the normally resected glioblastoma. When they find it, they go, oh, we got to get this out right away, go right in, take it out. So when you compare something that was removed immediately to something that was removed after only a few weeks of a ketogenic diet, and you look at those and you go, something's going on here.
Already in that short period of time.
Hey friend, welcome back to another show. Today we're talking all things intermittent fasting and the ketogenic diet and other nutritional metabolic therapies with Miriam Kalamian, the author of this great book, Keto for Cancer. We get very personal. It's a long discussion, a somewhat emotional discussion, but packed with information and a lot of science and data. You see, Miriam's been doing this sort of diet therapy, metabolic therapies, and she first got into keto, and she's going to share this story, to help her son with the metastatic brain cancer back in 2007 when there was very limited resources compared to now in 2018. It's an awesome discussion. I really hope you enjoy it. The show notes are below this, and this show is brought to you by perfectketo.com, the makers of high-quality MCT oil and exogenous ketone formulas. They have a great promotion for the high-intensity health community. If you go to perfectketo.com/HIH for highintensityhealth.com, you can save over 20% on their great formulations. A personal favorite of ours is the Salted Carmel MCT oil powder. It tastes really great. It's great for like low-carb, high-fat desserts. It's great in your coffee. It's a new formula, and they also have electrolyte formulas and blood sugar health formulas. So again, if you want to save some money on some really high-quality formulations, you can go to perfectketo.com/HIH and save over 20% off. So let's dive back into it with Miriam.
Miriam, thanks so much for coming on. It's great to be with you.
Wonderful to be here finally.
In person?
To do this in person, it's really a thrill for me.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you. Well, Montana's beautiful. I'm very excited. I want to explore a little bit more this afternoon.
Yeah, we are too.
Cool. Gonna go hiking?
Mm-hmm. Hiking.
Nice. Yeah. Do you have snowshoes, or are you just going?
No, we're just going to find a trail that just has a few inches of snow and go for it.
Yeah. Awesome. So you've been doing keto pretty exclusively for the past 10 years, right? More.
Yes, actually, my husband has done it much more rigorously than me. But we both do it. We both walk the walk.
Mm-hmm. There must have not been. I mean, I remember when I first heard about it in 2002. In the bodybuilding world, people were doing it, and there wasn't the research that we have, the lay press, all the bloggers, and all that. So it must have been an uphill climb because you were doing it for yourself, but also for your child at that point. And the medical community kind of poo-pooed the diet at that point, right?
Oh, not just poo-pooed it. They were just totally oppositional, throwing up obstacles. Luckily, we had a local team that was very supportive. But yeah, I mean, I got to say, we would never have gotten there. I would never have learned about the diet. We would never have done this if it wasn't just this accidental discovery online, just as my son was heading for a steep cliff. He was just a little guy. He was 7 at the time, and we'd been dealing with this tumor for like 2.5 years, brain tumor. So yeah, finding the diet was just amazing. And actually, when we got this amazing MRI 3 months on the diet, I was just blown away. We were all blown away. We were hoping just to kind of slow things down a little bit, give us a little more time with this little guy. But yeah, it was more than that. It was very, very dramatic.
The regression.
Yes, the fact that no chemotherapy had slowed it down, that no surgery had slowed it down, and now he had hydrocephalus on top of it all, and pituitary and hypothalamic issues, and here this just stopped it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What can you quantify the progression, or sorry, the percent of regression, like between successive MRIs, and if so, like how much are we talking, so people can kind of quantify?
So here was a tumor that was out of control and was growing rapidly, and I can't give you the stats on the rapid growth, but I can tell you that in 3 months of diet and a very weak chemo drug that just kept our oncologist in his profession's good graces. My son had already failed that one. The tumor, by anybody's estimate, 10 to 15%.
Wow.
So it had quieted down metabolically. So it had regressed 10 to 15%. So it was smaller in all dimensions. It was huge. It was the size of an orange when we started out, when we learned about it. And so to have that just stop like that was pretty amazing.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
And now you since have gotten a master's degree in nutrition, you're reading the biochemistry, working with Seyfried and William Curtis and others. From a mechanistic standpoint, a lot of people that tune into our podcast like to know the details. Can you speculate onto maybe how the body, or how the body's immune defenses, or how does it shrink like that when you go keto?
Okay, so let me add another thing here. We were doing it wrong. We were using the model for kids with epilepsy, but also listening to what Tom Seyfried was saying about calorie restriction. So we combined the two. I thought I was doing a 4-to-1 ratio, but when you add the calorie restriction, we were more along the lines of a lower ratio. But the important thing was the calorie restriction. Yeah. And we could do this with my little guy because he suffered from what they call hypothalamic obesity, which was the damage to the hypothalamus from the tumor, and so the hyperinsulinemia that results from that just made him a little eating machine. He was like a hungry little bear all the time. He'd go out and he'd eat windfall pears with hornets in them, and he'd go and eat green tomatoes off the vine. So he was just driven to eat, and the ketogenic diet resolved that as well, because as his insulin was lowered and he wasn't spiking it, that all quieted down despite the ongoing damage to the hypothalamus. That didn't go away. The tumor was still there.
That's amazing.
I know. So why wouldn't somebody want to do this?
Seriously.
Yeah.
So the appetite suppressing effects of the ketones really help to override like a pathological dysfunction in the hypothalamus. So, I mean, for folks that have heard of like leptin resistance and all that, I mean, that's really at that brain center that we're talking about here. So that is really profound. Yeah.
And, I wish that we had known then what I understand now, and we would have done some, baseline testing and then ongoing, but we didn't. At one point, we were looking at insulin and IGF-1, and those things were on the low end, but they weren't super low. But given the damage that he had, having an insulin, fasting insulin, I think it was 6, was pretty good. So as far as the mechanism for it to work, just the fasting mimicking that goes on by just switching to a ketogenic diet. And he was real low carb. We had him at like 10 to 12 grams of carb a day. Protein sufficient for his weight, which was the same model as the kids for epilepsy, but they don't calorie restrict those kids. They don't need to. And to get the most effectiveness out of this diet, we decided to calorie restrict. And that impacts angiogenesis. So mechanistically, what you're doing through those nutrient sensing pathways is saying, oh, there aren't really the right kinds of nutrients for growth here. Let's clean up our act a little bit, and we're going to shut down this aberrant network that we've built to feed the tumor. So that is most likely, from what I hear from from people that have looked at those scans is that's most likely what was going on in that first 3 months was, reducing the metabolic activity.
Mm-hmm. So starving out the aberrant cancer cells.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big adaptation, is it not, in cancer, the angiogenesis, and the cancer kind of needs to fuel itself with sugar and everything to propel the growth. So it's like cutting off the hose, to a garden. The plants are going to die essentially.
Yeah. So but people think that we can starve. That's the simple view. That's where they often start, and that's one of the reasons I wrote my book. Was like I really had to get out there that is so much more than starving your tumor of glucose. Mm-hmm. You have glutamine in there for one thing, and you have these metabolic pathways that are dysregulated in cancer. So you have the mTOR pathway, mammalian target of rapamycin. So you have the mTOR pathway. You have the IGF-1 pathway. So for people with cancer, they may have heard that their IGF-1 pathway is upregulated. And that is a hormone, it's a growth hormone, and it's associated with insulin. So it's very similar to insulin, uses some of the same receptors as insulin. So, but what it does is it just is like, let's get this stuff in here and let's signal this cancer cell to grow. We're going to tell it the growth signaling instead of saying, there's something wrong with me in here and we should really kick this one out. Mm-hmm. So to have a diet that can impact, they're always looking for ways to impact in the pharmaceutical world to impact mTOR and impact IGF-1, and the other cancer-promoting pathways, and to upregulate pathways associated with health. But they're looking at it one drug at a time, and they're not looking at it as a total system. We are a system, exquisite system. And in order for this, to be successful, you're got to take a systems approach. And the ketogenic diet is the systems approach. Yeah.
One thing that I've struggled to explain to people, I think it's a brilliant point that goes along with the mTOR and the growth and so forth, is that the ketogenic diet is anti-catabolic. So in a sense, right, mm-hmm. like it spares protein and all that, but it's not necessarily growth promoting. Right. Can you help us better understand that? Because I think for some people it's hard to grasp a little bit and it leads then into protein intake, and you hit on it a little bit, because we're seeing a lot of people that have been keto for a while go into this carnivorous diet and really enhancing their protein intake to an extreme amount, which if that benefits them for depression or whatever condition, great. But maybe all that protein may not be needed due to the inherent effects of the...
Yeah, I really think that limiting the protein is essential in having a successful approach to ketogenic diet for cancer. Without limiting the protein, you're stimulating mTOR throughout the system. So what we want to do with cancer is keep that mTOR synthesis, that mTOR upregulation specific to the muscle tissue. Mm-hmm. So that is, I talk to everybody about the need to do some resistance training, the need to do some cardio. You got to keep the system working optimally, because if you don't, that's where you can run into some trouble. As you're losing weight, you're going to lose fat mass, but you're also going to lose muscle mass. Mm-hmm. So if you keep stimulating through exercise, keep stimulating the muscle, the breakdown, and then it's calling for the right things to rebuild the muscle. That's the workaround in cancer to the low protein thing. And I'm low protein. I'm still building muscle. There's not. I think it's a false idea in people's heads that they can do this for cancer. There's some research, but it wasn't really, I don't know. There's so many things that when I look at that particular research on a meat and fat diet, I say, yes, it's worked for that individual, and it's worked for that individual. And if I sat down and talked to them, I'd probably figure out why it worked for those individuals, or I'd find out that they weren't really just meat and fat. And I have done that with several people, and I have found out that it wasn't just meat and fat. Even athletes don't need as much protein as they think they do. I'm sure you're not at the same, I'm sure, but I would guess that you're not at the same protein intake that you might have been earlier on in your...
No, definitely way less. Yeah, especially since being, in the last 3 years, hardcore keto, I find that I can do more with less.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great approach, just philosophically. I mean, why I like not having to eat as often. I mean, it takes time away from productivity, and it's expensive and all that. So that's just my personal approach.
Yeah.
You know.
And when people call this a high protein, high protein diet and the damage to the environment through eating animals and all that, it's like, just do it responsibly. There's a lot of damage to the environment, even in people who are eating plant-based diets. There's going to be damage to the environment. So just kind of mitigate that. And so if somebody was to look at the amount of protein I have in a meal, they'd go, whoa, that's not even as much as what I'm taking in, for the most part. So, it would be really hard for me to believe that people can be truly ketogenic. Like you said, there may be some specific issues that are, and especially if somebody has some real issues, digestive issues around the digestion of plants, then they're going to want to go in the other direction. But I see this as a continuum, and I see on one end you've got the vegan community and what they stand for, and they're zealots, and then on the other end you have carnivory, and they are zealots also. And I think there's so much more of us that are going to fit in that middle spot, and maybe kind of over here at times, maybe back over down here at times. And I if you're getting the results that you want, isn't that the diet you should be on?
That's
the
a
one
great
that's
point.
getting the desirable results.
Yeah. And then ebb and flow, I mean, it brings up the element of seasonality that kind of gets lost in the narrative. And how do you feel about that? Maybe even if you are keto for a specific condition, maybe in the summer or fall, I mean, this is my own belief because I'm maybe biased because I have a garden and I love fruit and all that. Having more seasonally available fruits, how do you feel about that?
I do. In the summer, I eat more berries. There's no doubt about it, because they're available and they're tastier than the winter berries might be. Yeah, there's room for that. Once you've got this diet, and Jeff Volek calls it dialed in, once you've got this diet dialed in, I think even with cancer, there's some leeway in that. And I think there's some real benefit to seasonality. I mean, when we're going into the fall and winter, I want a lot of those, those stewed meat meals. And rutabaga is very keto. You can put a rutabaga in there. And in the summer, I want more salads, but salads don't really appeal to me in the winter. And it makes sense that they don't appeal to me in the winter.
Right.
It's just I had some beets that were left over. 50 grams of beets, by the way, does not budge my glucose.
Wow.
So I had some beets that were left over, finally cooked them up, and it's like, had a serving of them. And it's like, what am I doing there? We're moving into spring now, so bye-bye.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Very interesting. Going back to calculating, actually, I guess I want to give a little bit of argument for the carnivore diet and so forth. That some proponents say that eating all these vegetables is as unnatural as eating all the meat, because they're cultivated in modern products of agriculture. So what would you say to that in speaking specifically about like the digestibility and some of the anti-nutrients when it comes to eating these vegetables that we know have health properties? How do you feel there, and should we be having as many vegetables as some vegans say we should have, 10 to 12 servings? What are your thoughts?
I have seen the worst outcomes in people who eat those 10 to 12 servings of fruits and vegetables a day in cancer. I'm not going to speak to anything else, but I suspect this is true in a lot of these diseases, especially the diseases we call aging. Like I said, we're in this exquisite system. We're designed to be able to take in a variety of different things. So hormesis, I mean, if you think of hormesis, it's pushing your body to deal with the things that are coming into it. Unless you have a specific, like I have some histamine issues developed over the last 20 years. I know where they came from, and but I have to live with it now. And so I'm a little more careful about the amount and the quality of the meat that I take in. But I don't have a problem with the cruciferous vegetables. I can eat those. So I understand the concept, and I understand the science of it, and I understand why the plant-based community thinks we need all these antioxidants and phytochemicals, and I understand why the carnivore community thinks that we don't want them. But you gotta come together at some point and look at our evolutionary biology. That is like the prime source of how we can handle the stuff that comes in. And I think it's actually good to push your system a little bit in that direction, just as you would push your system through a sauna or through a cold bath or any other, a rougher hike one day or a rougher workout one day and then a lighter one. So that keeps, God, Jeff Volek did a paper, published a paper on mitohormesis.
Okay, I think I've seen that title circulating.
Yeah. So check it out sometime. But that is that is so natural to people to be, to have that stimulation and then deal with it and have that stimulation. If our lives were the same all the time, I think it would be one, boring, but another, that's not the way we're designed.
Right. Really good point. You mentioned cold shower, colds therapy. I did a cold shower here this morning, which I've been doing for a while now, and the water is so much colder in Montana. It was really a challenge in a good way. But I've noticed that for some keto people, there's that whole CPT1 SNP, and I think the Inuit folks. So the inability to transfer fatty acids inside the inner mitochondrial membrane to synthesize acetyl-CoA and then go down into the cycle of ketogenesis. There's a high prevalence of this SNP, and I wonder have you found a correlation between being keto and resilience to cold? I notice I personally get colder easier in the winter. Maybe that could be less body fat, but have you found any correlation there?
Boy, I don't hear that from my clients, but my personal experience and the experience of my husband is we're warmer now. I'll eat a fat heavy meal, and like an hour later, I'm sitting there sweating.
Yeah.
And I always used to wear wool socks to bed. Always wore wool socks to bed. I don't wear socks to bed anymore. Or if I do, then they're kicked off in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And I don't throw the covers off in the middle of the night. It's a whole different thing for me. I was always the one going around with a down vest on, and it's cool in this room right now.
Yeah,
I'm not the least bit cool. So I think that we're burning more of that brown fat, and that's the heat producing. Plus, there's thermogenesis going on when you're oxidizing fat. There's more thermogenesis, and I don't remember exactly the biochemistry for that, but I know that that's the way it is.
Yeah, so more energy is lost as heat, so it's warming the body. Okay. Yeah, there must be some individual things. That's me personally, I've noticed that.
It may be, it may be a reduction in body fat stores, or it may just be that there's a difference in metabolism, and it's a more thrifty metabolism because nutrient sensing is saying we're not getting some. I'm just throwing stuff out. I'm just speculating.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So going back to protein, I'm not a huge fan of tracking macros. I think it's great for some people, but I love that intuitive approach. But I love how your book, you outline some very specific guidelines for people. When it comes to protein, you have a little different approach, and correct me if I'm wrong, looking at lean body mass and calculating protein intake based upon that. What are some targets for people with cancer than maybe without? When it comes to protein?
Very good question, and it comes up all the time, and I could think of 1,000 examples. Okay, so protein, in my book I use lean body mass because I think it's a better gauge. I mean, when you look at the RDA for protein, the dietary allowance, it is based on a certain group, a population of healthy people, and it's meant to hit, I think it's like 97.5% or something of healthy people, meet the needs of healthy people. But it's very conservative. So they use body weight because it's so much easier to get body weight in a huge population than it is to calculate lean body mass. And people can be notoriously bad at calculating lean body mass. So in my book, I do say if you can get a lean body mass measurement, go with that, and 1.0 grams per kilogram of body weight is sufficient protein for most people. But a lot of the people that I work with are either coming out of chemo or going into chemo or have had surgery, had these catabolic things going on. And I don't necessarily want to be in, like you mentioned, it's catabolic. I don't really want them to be as catabolic, so we need to provide some extra protein. So, but 0.2, 0.3 extra above and beyond is enough, and I think may be enough. And that is often just 4, 5, 6 extra grams. So if you're using body weight, again, the RDA uses body weight. But when you consider that 2/3 of the population is overweight or obese, why are we using body weight? We should be looking at ideal body weight. And even if you use an imperfect measure like BMI to figure what your ideal body weight is, if you use that and then go 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, you're in that safe zone. You know, and I want to just throw out a caveat there for pregnant women and women who are breastfeeding. They really need to be working with a specialist if they're going to do a ketogenic diet for any reason.
And why would that be?
Their protein needs are going to be greater, but they also have certain macronutrient needs. I mean, micronutrient needs that may not be met through a ketogenic diet because they're producing milk for another human being that you want to grow. You want it to be anabolic, so they might need a different mix of things. So, but I think most women know that, but not all women know that, and I have a little uncomfortableness with women that may not know that they're pregnant yet, and they start a ketogenic diet. So I would just kind of err on the side of caution there. Sort of like the folate thing.
Totally.
Yeah.
Great point.
You know, we kind of lowered as a country. We did a lot of damage in doing so, but by providing folic acid, synthetic vitamin in grains, enriched grain products, we turned the number of spinal cord, neural tube defects down.
Yeah.
We brought it down.
Even though we don't promote folic acid consumption per se, but you know, in low amounts, it seems to have had like a big effect on the population level.
Yeah, much better if people are eating the right foods instead and getting their folate that way.
Yeah, but going back to pregnancy, I mean, what are your thoughts? Obviously, I think that's a great recommendation. Meet with a practitioner, a specialist that is well versed in this area. But John Rowe has talked about how the ketone bodies provide a great carbon substrate for the brain, and so there's that evidence. But then there was an animal model study, I think at University of Oregon in earlier this year in 2018. And they fed pregnant, I think it was mammals, it was monkeys. Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
Anyway, the chow was really, really bad. I mean, it was canola-based and soy-based. So that was the keto chow that they used, but they did show like developmental delay in the primate offspring using this type of high-fat chow.
DHA. Were they getting DHA? Was their diet enriched? Do you know?
No, I don't think so.
Well, if you don't have DHA on board, you're going to have stunted brain development.
Right.
And that was one thing they figured out for formulas. But early on, formulas didn't have DHA. Early on, formulas didn't have medium chain triglycerides. Now, if you look at baby formula, and I don't recommend that people do this, but some people have to do it. If you look at baby formulas, there's medium chain triglycerides in there. So if they had supplemented these, instead of using canola or soy, which are, soy is inflammatory, if they just coconut oil, I mean, it's not a native thing for mice to use, but if they used coconut oil with its lauric acid and its medium chain triglycerides, would that have provided enough ketones in a positive kind of way?
Right. Good point.
For brain development, yeah.
Yeah.
You got to provide everything. You can't just like go and say, oh, no, their brains didn't develop, without looking at what the confounding factors were.
Right, and that's why saying high fat or high protein, it's so ambiguous. It doesn't like narrow down the specifics that matter. Like you're saying, these specific chain lengths of fats that are very important in brain development.
And so, was this ketogenic chow or was it high fat chow?
It was high fat chow.
Okay, so I got to get on my soapbox for this one. This is like a really thing I got to get out there. When you read a story, a research paper that says high fat diet, it's like I just kind of move those to the trash. I don't even consider them because a high fat diet is generally around 45% fat in these mouse models. So they take sometimes they take this mouse model that's genetically engineered to get obese and diabetic, and then they feed it this diet that consists of 45% fat and 30% carbohydrate. And the 30% carbohydrate, 15% of it is sucrose, so it's glucose and fructose, and then 15% of it is straight starch, so it's glucose and glucose. So what is doing the harm there?
Yeah.
It's the combination, and I think that people in our world have figured that out. You can't have a diet as high as 30% carbohydrate and expect to have a good result paired with a high-fat diet, doesn't matter how good quality the fat is, whether it's saturated or unsaturated, you're not going to get as good an outcome as you would if you go truly ketogenic. And so when it says ketogenic, I'm going to take it a little more seriously, but I'm also going to look at the chow. I saw one study with a bad effect, and I looked at the chow, which you can find because it's in the methods. So I looked at the chow, and it was hydrogenated lard.
Oh my
gosh.
gosh.
And even keto the one that was used in Dr. Seyfried's study and had been used in a lot because it's what they fed kids. The original version of that was hydrogenated soybean oil. I'm not kidding.
Wow.
And a whole load of synthetic vitamins. So is this like the ideal food to give to a mouse? No wonder the mice that are calorie restricted are doing better because they're using their own body fat instead of that crap they're being fed.
That's a wonderful point.
Yeah.
Yeah, you really have to dig into the details. A lot of people just skim the abstract, or they look at Science Direct or Medical Express, and they see high fat, and then they say, look at the study. But then you actually have to go to.
It should come with a huge warning sign on it if it says high fat. And so many people. That's one of the the most common things I get in my inbox is people saying, well, this study showed this happening. And my other thing in inbox is, just to go off on a little bit of a tangent, is people showing, oh, ketones did this. Well, I look at the study and it was like in vitro, yeah. So ketones did that to a cell in a manipulated environment. Would anybody consider this evidence for a positive effect using the nutrition guidelines? No, they'd have to have that would be that could be the thing that guides some hypothesis making for the preclinical models, the mouse models, and then that in turn would guide the hypotheses for human trials or case studies or whatever. But it's never used as evidence. So why would I see it as evidence?
Yeah, great point. Speaking of tangents, I love this conversation. This is awesome. The Diet Fit study from Stanford. Did you read that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, that was recently. So we did a review on it on the YouTube channel, but it was very interesting. It was low carb versus low fat. That was one. It was just published at 8 weeks ago. Maybe.
Yeah. I think I may have heard that one.
But they allowed the individuals. There was no quantification. They just say try to go as low as you can go, and they didn't look at body fat. And then they allowed the individuals to, and low as you can go being low fat or low carb, and or high. Sorry, high fat low carb versus high carb, low fat. And they said there's no difference in outcomes, but they didn't track anything, and they allowed the people to just basically eat whatever they want. And so then the media said, see, there's no difference, but you actually have to download the materials and methods and a secondary supplemental paper. So point of this is there's so many nuances. So you got to work with, follow someone like Miriam or others who are doing the research and digging deeper, because the abstracts are not going to lead you down the right track.
Right, and so we hit paywalls on so many things too.
Yeah.
So you read the abstract and I just want to dig into the paper. Like I said, when I get into a paper and I look at the methodology and I see there's the mouse chow specified, and then I'll just go and look at the mouse chow. And so I have some of these charts. It's like, you could feed them layers of love brownie, and it would have the same diet composition as what they were fed. And does anybody think that layers of love brownie as an exclusive diet is going to be healthy? No, nobody thinks that.
Yeah.
So, and we just need we need better education for everyone. I mean, I grew up believing in those guidelines. I grew up thinking, now I was having a healthy diet. I ate a healthy diet. And I didn't I had a can of Coke a day. But that was okay because you have this allowed amount of sugar, right? This allowable amount that's supposedly not doing any damage. Well, the only reason I stopped it at the time was because, I've had a history of really problem teeth since I was a little kid. I started eating sugar really early on. And I stopped it because I didn't want to do any further damage to my teeth. And with no other change, and I wasn't looking for weight loss, pretty lean anyway, but with no other change, I dropped a couple of pounds in, a month or a month and a half just from dropping that soda. So it's why would we think that there's a safe amount of sugar that people can add to their diets? The New York Times just did this. and they just repeat it so often in the last couple of days. This thing about, oh yeah, well I cut out sugar for a month. It's like, no, you cut out added sugar for a month. You didn't look at the naturally occurring sugars that are just as dangerous, in my opinion, eaten in high amounts as the added sugars. Fructose, of course, is particularly dangerous, but all of it is dangerous. So to say that there's a safe allowable amount, no, we should be telling people, we don't think this is really good for you. If you're going to do it at your own risk. And then a lot more people would be, that awareness, creating that kind of awareness could have changed the way I ate much earlier on.
And then affected the trajectory of your life.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I came to this really late. And I'm glad I found it. I'm much more mentally clear than I was. I'm not suffering from those senior moments where, or what did I do with my keys, or what did, that kind of thing even. I see pictures in my head, which is great when I'm trying to recall things. And that just wasn't where I was headed. I was like in the herd.
Yeah.
In the herd.
So the core message is maybe do your own homework and don't trust the government when it comes to nutrition often, or?
Yeah, I'd say we can't trust the guidelines. And right now, please everybody, there's this short comment period. I'm not sure when it's up. Do you know when it's up?
Nina's, she's working on that Nutrition Coalition.
Is it the end of this month?
I think, end of March.
End of March. Okay, and you've gotten something out on your site already?
Yeah, I've been,
okay.
That's amazing.
All right. Yeah, we've been tweeting and Facebooking it and everything. But yeah, we have this limited period of time. And off on this other day. When I was preparing some materials and I dug deep into this and I was looking at all of these different versions, these different editions of the guidelines, different editions in book form, because things can change on the internet. But I bought the books and I'm going through them. And I found one year, and I think it was 2005, but I wouldn't swear to it, where it basically said, hey, you don't need carbs. We have zero requirement for carbs. We have this, this protein target, but we'll make the right amount of glucose. We'll make physiological, normal amounts of glucose through even zero carb diets. And then the next year, that was gone. And it was replaced with, well, the reason why we have these guidelines for 130 grams is that your brain needs it for the brain needs glucose. And I had to answer that on, you probably didn't going where you were, but I had to, in my graduate course, I had to continuously
battle that
and the quizzes. I had to go against what I knew on quizzes to say that the brain needed 130 grams of, no, it needs the energy equivalent of 130 grams. It does not need those 130 grams as sugar. It needs the energy equivalent, and up to 60-70% of that can be met with ketones. There's a small amount that does need to be met by glucose, but our bodies make it. So we strip the glycerol off the triglycerides and we send that to the liver, and that becomes the sugar that our bodies need, the glucose that our bodies need. So can you imagine if somebody is eating exclusively meat, how much of that is getting converted? Because the proteins, the amino acids from proteins, can't be stored. So they get converted into glucose and put back out into the system. So it may only look like a small difference with a finger prick, but it's relentless. It's time
Ongoing.
after time after time. And if you're insulin sensitive, then the insulin stimulation that you get, I shouldn't say insulin stimulation, the rise in insulin that's associated with proteins, because proteins are anabolic.
Yeah.
So you get that rise in insulin that's associated with all of them, even more so with dairy and egg proteins. And that, I think what some people look at is, well, it's not enough to suppress ketones. But I don't know. If you're doing the math and you're doing the tracking, you're going to see that rise in glucose. And so when I compare like a classic ketogenic diet with like a modified Atkins or a more liberalized ketogenic diet, and I see that there's about 12 milligrams per deciliter difference between the average of those two diets, I go, well, that 12 milligrams per deciliter may mean the difference between a brain tumor growing and a brain tumor not growing. It may not mean much in the in the carnivore world, but as far as the cancer goes, it might mean the difference between the tumor staying stable and the tumor growing. So and also the glutamine. The glutamine issue is huge in cancer, and that's my fear about that movement is that, okay, you got to nuance it for cancer. You have to nuance it for people who are older. You have to nuance it for people who are buying poor quality meats, or living on. I talked to one guy just yesterday, and he said, "Yeah, I see. It's not just the foods. I thought I was doing okay on Atkins. I'd stop at Wendy's and I'd buy a burger and I'd throw away the bun. But now I understand that that's not really the best quality food that I could be eating, because we're doing so much better at home."
Yeah, that may be keto from a macro perspective, but you were missing out on some of the other perspectives. So that 12 nanograms per DL, you were saying, is that glucose or was that insulin?
You can't measure insulin in that way. That's glucose. So it's milligrams per deciliter. So it's like if you do a finger prick and you're in ketosis and with a strict carbohydrate restriction, really rigorous carbohydrate restriction, you might see a number around 65 or 70. But if you're not, you might see a number around 85. And for the people that the athletes, is that going to matter? No, probably not. It's not going to matter, because they're not getting the spikes from the carb loading and all of that. So they're not doing that to their bodies. But as far as a brain tumor goes, that just may be enough stimulation to open up those pathways, plus the extra glutamine. And glutamine, I have to stress, is not just through protein-containing foods. Glutamine is also cancer robs glutamine from its neighbors. That's not necessarily true for in a normal non-cancer person, although you do release a lot of glutamine through muscle breakdown too. So when people are doing this for cancer, at least in the beginning, I do say, oh, please just stick to light or moderate exercise and leave the vigorous for later, just enough to stimulate and keep that muscle mass while you're going through your treatment.
It seems like the glutamine world is somewhat controversial, because we know that, like you're talking about, cancer cells can utilize this, but glutamine does offer support for the GI tract.
It does.
So you talk about this in the book, and can you summarize what you think, the perspective?
Yeah. Sure. It's I don't think there's a controversy around it. It's just that it's a double-edged sword. Like you said, we need it for immune function. Our immune system in the gut is about 85% of our protection. So we don't want things, we want to have a really healthy gut. So that's one of the things that Tom Seyfried is really big on right now. He just needs the funding to get there. He says, he calls it the front door and the back door. So he says, it's one thing to shut down glucose coming in the front door, but if you leave the back door open, glutamine's going to get in. And, and like I said, it's a double-edged sword. So you can't use drugs that are going to shut down every day this glutamine. So he's talking about pulsing it. So you do a certain, the press part of this, he calls it press pulse therapy. So the press part of this is the diet.